very interesting. I believe it was Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace who said that the last great farm program was the Garden of Eden. and then Icky received a comment about criticism of these animal livestock reductions, and he said the Constitution does not grant the right of a pig to grow to full pigginess. So there were some real characters in the New Deal. How did the Department of Agriculture's assessment of the drought differ from the Department of the Interior's view?
That's a tough question, because Interior has things like the Forest Service. The Forest Service is under agriculture because you were growing trees. You know, there were bureaucratic fights within a larger scheme of how do you restore. And the question on restoration was, could you actually grow things again? Now, I want to put this in perspective. I mentioned this morning to the kids. One storm, Black Sunday, April 14th, 1935, the USGS measured it this way. They said more dirt was thrown to the sky in that one storm, mostly one day, a Sunday morning, beautiful Sunday morning, than was dug out to build the Panama Canal, which took 7 years to build. That's an awful lot of soil being thrown into the sky. You were telling me earlier about how long it takes to make soil in this part of the country. It's basically the broken down remnants of the Rocky Mountains that flows downstream, settles in the high plains. So when you strip away that even inch of soil, you're down to some pretty bare, hard pan. So one of the policy questions of government was, well, you can't bring in dirt. What are you going to do? Can you restore the soil itself? And ultimately this led to, I don't know as much about the bureaucratic stuff as I do know about what ideas were thrown around. And there were two big ideas. One was new grasslands. Can you plant grass new on this land? And if you go around today, most of you know this, most other Americans don't know this, we have these things called national grasslands. And there's 16 million acres of the old Dust Bowl that are now run by the Forest Service in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they're labeled national grasslands. And in fact, they're big tourist destinations for birders. Birders are the fastest growing recreational group, outdoor recreational group in America. In some cases, there are more birders than hunters. So they like this restored prairie. And it's been a real mixed result. They didn't know what kind of seed to use. In some cases, the soil was gone. I remember you see these areas where there are just dunes left, where the soil blew up against the fence posts, the fence lines. And there's plenty of sort of sterile dust there, but then you have other places that are scraped away. The other effort was aimed at getting farmers to till the land differently. And that's where Bennett came in. That's where local efforts came in. The Civilian Conservation Service. And basically, the only New Deal grassroots legacy left over, the only legacy left over from the New Deal are these soil conservation districts, which are largely local folks saying, now let's treat this land as a unit.
In the book, The Worst Hard Time, which, by the way, signed copies are available in the museum gift shop while you're here. In your great book, you talk about a big shift, and that comes when President Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9028, which was a huge shift in federal policy because of its effort to buy back land. Why, could you elaborate a little bit on that? Why was that such a huge shift from everything that had done before?
It was a very emotional and historically difficult thing to do, to admit defeat. Because, again, they had just, not even in a generation's time, 15 years earlier, had opened up this land to homesteading, and it was a big success. There were wet years in the 1920s. World War I prompted the price of wheat to spike because Russia was the only other real wheat exporting nation. They were closed off in their shipping channels. So the United States, for the first time in its history, became a net wheat exporter, and there were signs all over saying, grow more wheat. The government encouraged you to grow more wheat. There were signs in New York City that said, eat more bread. They were going out of their way to try to get people to consume bread, to have wheat, and wheat became a commodity. It became a thing like, like silver, or like stocks, or like any of these things that become commodities. So it was such a success for a while. People were getting rich. I mentioned this morning there was a rancher, a woman who had only been in this thing for 10 years. She boasted that she made more money than Babe Ruth, the highest paid baseball player ever made. And there were these suitcase farmers, so-called, because they would just show up at the railroad stations and go out and claim a piece of homestead ground, have it plowed up, throw that dryland wheat in the fall, come back in the spring and harvest it with their suitcases. And when the stuff all blew away, they deserted it. They abandoned it. Those weren't the homesteaders. Those were the suitcase farmers. So this had been a success. And then to suddenly admit that it was a terrible defeat, that it had all been a mistake, that perhaps farming and settlement itself has been, as they said, an accident of history. It was a very tough thing. So setting the stage for the executive order, for the government to go out and actually buy your land, there were the relocation services, and say, we want you to go somewhere else. Now, I live in the Pacific Northwest, and at the time, shortly after the Dust Bowl, they started building the world's greatest dam, the Grand Coulee Dam, to dam the Columbia River. Now, most of you know the Pacific Northwest is wet, but as soon as you go east of the Cascade Mountains, it's bone dry. And that's what they were going to make into this new farmland. So this is an interesting footnote. All these folks who were living in the Dust Bowl, whom the government was going to buy out, they were going to send them to the Northwest, to what the government called, this is its proper name, the Planned Promised Land. And it was going to be all this irrigated land from the Grand Coulee Dam. So they urged people to go to the Yakima Valley in Washington State, go to the Wenatchee Valley, and go to this arid steppe land, which was going to be newly irrigated when they backed up the Columbia River with the greatest dam. So that's what the relocation service was all about. Now, what happened to the Planned Promised Land? World War II. That power from that dam was used to defeat the Nazis, because they built B-17s, thousands of them a day were cranked out the power from the Columbia River, and ultimately the atomic bomb was generated off of Grand Coulee Dam juice. So it was one of these things, you plan for a promised land, you end up defeating a tyrant like Hitler. Interesting quirk.
It truly is all connected, because the Tennessee Valley Authority was another attempt in region building, where to restore the land ruined by erosion in the Tennessee Valley River area, but it was those power plants that converted aluminum ore, or bauxite, to aluminum for the plains that won the war. So it is connected to Grand Coulee Dam. But that brings, what I'm thinking about is that region building was an effort of the New Deal, whether it was the Pacific Northwest and the Grand Coulee Dam or the Tennessee Valley Authority. Was there a discussion, or did you come across any diary entries about region building on the plains? Was there an attempt to say, what are we going to do to make this a long-term economic solution, make it viable?
Yeah, that's a great question, because this region was built by two things. Market forces initially for cattle. The English came here because you'd see these things circulating all over London that said, get rich quick, these stock selling schemes in cattle in this part of the country. So go to the high plains and you were going to get rich in the cattle game. That was the initial sort of market force that drove this. It took government to settle this area. It took the Homesteading Act, which was not a market force. The railroads went to the government and said, you better double the Homestead Act. They had just laid all these tracks, and they wanted a town about every 7 miles, which is why you have little towns out in the prairies that are drying up right now, because the railroads had a town about every 7 to 12 miles to be the sort of connectors for all this. That was government. Then market forces took over again in the 20s, when wheat was a speculative commodity. You had a price of a bushel of wheat was higher, not in inflation-adjusted dollars, in real dollars, than it is at times today. It got up to almost $5 a bushel. Now, I worked on a farm 20 years ago briefly, and there were times when wheat wasn't that much. Forget about adjusted for inflation. So again, government, market, government, market. Two things at force. Government saying settle it, market forces sending people here. Both of them had their busts too. They had their great years and they had their busts. Now, your question is, was there a concerted effort to settle one reason? Yes, of course, that's what the Homestead Act was. If you look at the map of the United States, at the dawn of the 20th century, there was one big empty hole where no one lived, and it was the High Plains. This was the last part of the country to be truly settled by people. They'd pushed all the Indians off of it too. So it really was a blank slate. It was, like I said, a tabula rasa. So yes, it was a government effort to settle. And then there was a government effort to resettle. Although they didn't send people to California, as you know from Steinbeck, who did get the first take on this story, when many so-called Okies arrived at the California border, there were signs that said, Okie, go home. There were signs that said, you know, use the back door. These people lost, some of them, their American basic rights, their First Amendment rights. They were put in jail, no habeas corpus. They were treated like non-citizens. In fact, they were citizens. So there was a government resettlement act, there was a market resettlement effort, and what I wrote about at the core was people who just weren't going to go anywhere and thought still they could make a go of it. Now, they went, this is important to understand, they went from making pretty good money in the wheat game to making nothing. The price of a bushel of wheat got down to 10 cents a bushel, and you couldn't give it away. And I saw these pictures of those railroad terminals I spoke of. Well, the wheat was just stacked there and rotting. It wasn't going anywhere. They did do what the government told them to do. They produced way too much wheat. They couldn't get rid of it. So what happened? You have suddenly your homestead, which had allowed you to rise from your dugout, rise from your sod house, put a nice extra addition onto the house. Some people had pianos. Some people had new cars. Your kids had nice clothes. You were prosperous. And suddenly you're living a subsistence lifestyle. Subsistence, whatever you could do. So you'd had your windmill. As long as the wind was blowing, you had hope. And the wind always blows, as you know here. So the wind would pull the water up from the ground and you had a little garden. And the wind would pull the water from the ground and you had a little water for your hogs and your livestock. But you just had that little subsistence garden. So you went from being part of these graded market forces, wheat farming, etc., to being someone living almost, I don't want to say caveman because that's unfair, but a subsistence existence. You know, just a real basic scraping, getting by with what you could. One social side note, there's a scene in the movie Seabiscuit. Anybody seen the movie Seabiscuit or read the book Seabiscuit? Great story that shows Tobey Maguire's parents at the start of the movie, and it's part of the Great Depression, and they're broke, and they don't think they're going to be able to raise their kids, so they go down, they give their kids up to the county, to these orphanages. And I heard that anecdotally too, that people were so broke, poor, and afraid, they didn't even think they could raise their kids.